Chapter 6. The Lay of the Starved Fool. "But how did we come through from the church to the castle?" said David. The children sat by Malibran on the ridge clear of the hill. The dolmen arch was drab with lichen, and the stones of the avenue heeled like twisted palings. Clouds still rolled upon the plain, but there was a quickening in the air, and Phindias, Thalias, and Murias were etched in gold, as though they stood before the dawn. "It is not easy to cross from your world into this," said Malibran, "but there are places where they touch. The church and the castle. They were battered by war, and now all the land around quakes with destruction. They have been shaken loose in their worlds." "But the fiddle and the noise, what was that?" said Roland. "All things have their note and will answer to it." "You mean like a wine-glass ringing?" "Yes," said Malibran. "And when the church answered, it existed in both places at once. The real church and the echo of itself. Yet more than echo. For although you opened the door here, no door opened in your world."
"Can you always do this?"
said Helen. "No. The finding is chance. Wasteland and boundaries, places that are neither one thing nor the other, neither here nor there. These are the gates of Elidor."
"Isn't it funny how things happen?"
said Roland.
"You know, if we hadn't gone into Manchester today, and if we hadn't played that game with the map, and if the demolition gang hadn't had a tea break, all these little things happening at just the right time, all ending like this."
The children looked at the four treasures, sword, stone, spear, and cauldron, glowing in their hands.
"One each,"
said David. "Yes," said Malibran. And he took the fiddle and bow from under his cloak. They were slung on a cord across his shoulder, and there was also a pouch fastened to the cord. He opened it and took out an oblong package and began to unwrap layer after layer of very thin oiled cloth. He smoothed each layer and put it aside before peeling off the next. It was an old book made of vellum. The leaves were hard, glossy, and crimped with age. Malibran opened the book and held it out for the children to see. Side 3. Nothing that had yet happened to Roland compared with the shock of this moment. He was looking at a page of script written in a language that was unknown to him, and at the top of the page was a picture of himself, with Helen, Nicholas, and David by his side. The figures were stiff and puppet-like, and everything was out of scale, but there was no mistaking them. They stood close together, cradling the treasures in their arms, their heads tilted to one side, a blank expression on their faces, their toes pointing downwards. Next to them was a round hill with a dolmen in its side, and by it another figure, smaller than the children. Malibran. His arms were spread wide, and he held the fiddle in one hand and the bow in the other.
"We've even got the right treasures,"
said Roland. For in the picture he had a spear, and David the sword, Helen the cauldron, Nicholas the stone. Malibran put his finger on the script and read, "And they shall come from the waves, and the glory of Elidor shall pass with them, and the darkness shall not fade, unless there is heard the song of Findhorn, who walks in the high places."
"But who wrote it?" said David. "And how did he know?"
"This book was written so long ago," said Malibran, "that we have only legend to tell us about it. The legend says that there was once a ploughboy in Elidor, an idiot given to fits. But in his fit he spoke clearly, and was thought to prophesy. And he became so famous that he was taken into the king's household, where he swore that he would starve among plenty. And so it happened, for he was locked in a pantry and died there. However it was, his prophecies were written in this book, which is called The Lay of the Starved Fool. Through the years it has been read only for its nonsense. But when the prophecies started to be fulfilled, when the first darkness crept into Elidor, I saw in the Lay of the Starved Fool not nonsense, but the confused fragments of a dream. A dream that no sane man could bear to dream. A waking memory of what was to be. Since then I have worked to discover the truth hidden in the lay, because, you see, I knew nothing of what I have just told you about our two worlds. I have had to find out that for myself, by trial and thought, by asking all the time, how is this true? And if it is true, how can it be? Do you understand, then, what it was to find the note that made the church answer? To watch Phineas dissolve, to step through into your world, and to see you, whom I have known for so long, running towards me across the broken land?
It's as if everything that's ever happened was leading up to this, said Roland. You can't say how far back it started, everything working together like cogwheels. When I spun the street names, they had to stop at that one place.
That had been the moment when he'd felt that he was being watched. Remember, I have said the worlds are linked, said Malibran. And what you have done here will be reflected in some way at some time in your world.
Wait a minute, said Roland. Will you read us that bit out of the book again?
And they shall come from the waves, and the glory of Elidor shall pass with them. And the darkness shall not fade, unless there is heard the song of Findhorn, who walks in the high places.
We've been going on as though we've saved Elidor. And now that you've found the treasures, you'll be all right, said Roland. But doesn't the book mean that things will be worse, not better?
It does, said Malibran. We are not at the end, but at the beginning. But with the treasures, we may hold Gorias, and from there win back to the other castles. Then we shall have 4 islands in the darkness, and some of us may yet see Mondrum Green.
But who's Findhorn? Said Roland.
No one knows, said Malibran. There are desolate mountains far to the north at the edge of the world, where in the old days it was thought that demons lived. I think these are the high places. But Findhorn and the song are forgotten. And now that the treasures are safe, I can go to look for him there. I have proved the wisdom of the starved fool now, and that gives me the courage to prove it once again. They climbed down from the ridge into Mondrum and made their way back towards Findias through the slime. The journey seemed much shorter to Roland than when he'd been alone, or perhaps it was because Malibran knew where he was going and led them straight there. The treasures surrounded them in a field of colour which moved with them, so that as they came to a tree it would change from grey to purple, to the livid colours of decay, and then sink back into the dead light when they had passed by. They saw nothing of Findias until they reached the open ground below the forest 1/2 mile from the castle, and at this distance the golden outline didn't show, but the ruins were clear in detail, as though the children and Malibran were looking at them through a hole in a dirty window pane. When they were nearly at the drawbridge, Roland turned for a last sight of Elidor.
Malibran, something's happened on the ridge.
They could just see the ridge above the trees and the squat cone of Vandwy with the avenue leading from it. The standing stones of the avenue, which they had left in disorder, were now upright, sharp, harsh, and menacing. And as they watched, a dark beam like a black searchlight leapt from the mound. "Run!" shouted Malibran. "I have been too proud, and Vandwy has recovered from its wound." The beam circled, sweeping land and sky, and before the children reached the drawbridge, it caught them and locked onto them beyond escape. The air was as thick as water. It dragged about their limbs and clogged their lungs, and it was shot through with strands of blackness which their hands couldn't feel or push aside. But each strand plucked at their minds like wire as they blundered through. "Think of suns, meadows, and bright flowers. Think! Do not let night into your minds." Malibran walked beside the children, urging, driving them on. He moved freely, untouched by the dark. "Your strength is your weakness now. Vandwy has sent fear to be given shape by you. These shapes will be real, as the door was real. Keep them out!" But the fear was in the children, a numbness that sapped the will. And soon they began to hear in the forest the pursuit that they themselves were making. Slowly they crossed the bridge, but those few yards were longer than the whole journey. The children's vision was so blighted by the strands that they saw the bridge shoot out like a pier over the sea, and the castle was a speck where the lines of the planks converged in the distance. The bridge became higher and narrower, and then it was tilted to the left, and then to the right, and then upwards, so that they could not walk, and then down, so that they were on a wooden precipice and dared not move. And then the bridge swung completely over, and they felt that they would drop off into the sky. And all the time Malibran fought for their minds. "The bridge is safe. You will not stop. Think. Move." They reached the gatehouse, and as they laboured through to the courtyard, there bounded from the forest something that was on two legs but was not a man, and behind it the trees ran howling. The children fell into the courtyard, and the grip of Vandwy slackened. "Take the treasures," said Malibran. "No, you need them." "We are trapped. Take them to your world and guard them there. They will be safe, and while they are free, their light will not die in Elidor, and we may live."
"Come with us,"
said Helen. "I cannot. I must seal the gate. Nothing must follow you through the keep. Stand well clear on the other side."
"What shall we do with the treasures?"
said Roland. "No more than guard them. And if we fail here, the light of Elidor may live on and kindle again in other worlds." Malibran put the fiddle to his shoulder and began to play, faster and faster, until the notes merged and drove through the children, cutting the darkness from their minds, snapping the threads of Vandwy with the pain. The keep picked up the fiddle's notes, and the surface of the stone lost its hardness, rippled like skin. "Now go!" cried Malibran. "Go!" The ramparts by the gatehouse bristled with silhouettes. "Malibran, go!" The children staggered through the doorway of the keep. The ground shook so much that they could hardly stand. Their teeth burred in their heads. The walls were a fog of sound. Plaster came like snow from the ceiling. A gap appeared in front of them, and they pulled and pushed each other towards it and between two floorboards that were nailed across the gap, and ran, choking, out onto the wasteland of Thursday Street. The fiddle note held. Each brick in the derelict church was grinding against the next. Mortar dust spouted from the joints. "Look out!" Nicholas yelled. "It's going!" All the sounds rose together to one unbearable pitch. The wall bellied outwards, and the church fell in a groaning roar of destruction. "Roland! The treasures! What's happened to them?" But Roland was gazing at the tangled ruin of the church and couldn't answer.
"It's all right," he said at last. "It's all right. We'll be able to hide them now."
The children stood before the rubble as the dust cleared. It was late afternoon. A long way off, a woman pushed a pram. In his hand, Roland held a length of iron railing. Nicholas, a keystone from the church. David had 2 splintered laths nailed together for a sword, and Helen, an old, cracked cup with a beaded pattern moulded on the rim. Chapter 7. Corporation Property.
"We couldn't have looked after them as they were," said Roland. The children became aware of voices shouting. Several men had come out of a corner shop in a street on the edge of the wasteland and were running towards the church. But no one moved. It seemed to have nothing to do with them.
Olivia's! Olivia's this time!
The men were white with fear. The first one to arrive grabbed Nicholas by the back of his collar and swung him round.
Was there any of yous in there?
He shouted.
Let go, said Nicholas. You'll answer me! Was there any of yous in there?
Righto, Paddy, that's enough, said the biggest of the men. He wore a leather belt covered with regimental badges and appeared to be the foreman. Now then, he said, speaking to all the children, I want a straight answer. Was there any of you in there when she dropped?
No,
said Nicholas. The foreman sagged with relief, and the colour rose in his face. Now he could afford to be angry.
I've given you kids round here warning time and time again, but you'll not learn, will you? You'll not be satisfied till one of you's killed. Well, it's going to stop. Your parents can't manage you, seemingly, so we'll see what the police can do.
We've never been here, said Nicholas.
Now then, said the foreman, we want none of your lip. Hey, Governor, said the Irishman holding Nicholas, do you not think a good thumping might be better? No, Pad, you can't go on treating kids soft. Round here they think kindness is weakness, and something's got to be done. You know how it'd be the first time one of them's hurt, don't you? Gross negligence on the firm's part, that's what. Insufficient precautions and the like. No mention of all we had to contend with. No mention of malicious damage endangering safety of staff, damage to tools and plant, theft. Eh, Jack? Just have a look around while we're at it.
Right, said a boy wearing a tartan cap, jeans and mud-covered pointed shoes. He started to check the tools.
No, it's all here. Wait on. Someone's pinched me football.
Well, said the foreman. I'm sorry, said Roland. It's in there.
Indeed,
said the foreman. I kicked it through the window, and we went in to fetch it.
$6 it cost,
said Jack. We haven't any money on us, said David, but we'll send you a postal order.
Oh, aye. An example. That's what's going to be made of you, said the foreman. An example. I suppose you know nothing about the lead that went missing from the roof last night, do you?
Of course not, said Nicholas.
Of course not. Aye, well, we'll see, shan't we? Now drop those bits of scrap you got in your hands and come along. It's the police station for you. Keep fast to that biggest Pad. He'll be the ringleader.
There's no need, said Nicholas. We'll go with you. It's all a mistake.
It is that, said the foreman. Now drop that stuff.
No, said Roland.
You what?
We've not stolen them. They're ours.
Now look, I'm not here to argue, said the foreman. Put those things back where you found them.
They're not yours, said Roland.
Unlawful possession of corporation property, said the foreman, as well as trespass and wilful damage. It's not funny, my lad.
There were 5 men and Jack. They were strong, but heavily built. Jack was the only one who looked capable of any speed. Remember what happened to the apple branch? Roland said to Nicholas.
Yes, said Nicholas.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Right, said Roland, and he swung the length of railing up against the Irishman's elbow, down and sideways across Jack's shins, and ran. Through the din that broke out behind him, he could hear both the clump of Wellingtons and much lighter footsteps. But soon the Wellingtons faded.
"Keep going!" shouted Helen. "We're all here, and the treasures!"
The children stopped when they reached the first of the streets. Only 3 of the men had made any effort to catch them, but they'd given up and were now going back to join the foreman, who was waving his arms at the Irishman and Jack.
"I hope they're all right," said Roland, "but there wasn't anything else to do, was there? I mean, we couldn't tell them, could we?"
"If you'd any sense," said Nicholas, "you won't tell anybody ever, unless you want locking up."
"Do you think they really will fetch the police?"
said Helen. "I doubt it," said Nicholas. "Not now they've lost us. But let's be moving just in case." It was dark when the children reached Oldham Road, and rushing crowds filled the pavement.
"It's lucky we wanted to go this way,"
shouted Helen, and vanished behind a wedge of men all wearing bowler hats. She reappeared, her cup held at chin height to avoid being smashed. David and Roland had less trouble with their laths and railing, apart from a few angry grunts from people who came too near. But Nicholas was struggling with his keystone, shifting it from one hip to the other, and he was grey about the mouth. The pressure of the crowd eased as they came to the station forecourt.
"There's a train in 10 minutes,
said Helen. The crowd split at the barriers. Nicholas wobbled on one leg, balancing the stone on his knee, while he felt in his pocket for the tickets. "Here, David," he said. "You take them." David handed the tickets to the ticket collector, who was so busy with his punch that he never looked up until he noticed David. "What's all this here?" he said.
"There are tickets," said David.
"Aye, up and they are. But you don't think you're fit to travel on a train in that state, do you?" The children looked at themselves. They were all coated with slime from the forest of Mondrum, and on that was laid plaster, soot, and brick dust from the church.
"We'll stand,"
said David. "You will not," said the ticket collector.
"But we've paid."
A restless queue was building up. People were muttering, stamping, looking at watches. "Clear off," said the ticket collector, "and take your junk with you. I don't know how you've the cheek to try it on. There's a copper by the bookstore. Must I go and give him a shout? Eh? Thought not. Go on, off with you." The children slipped out of the queue and round the corner from the policeman.
"What do we do now?"
said Helen.
"Move along to platform 11,
said Roland. "We can cross onto our platform over the bridge at the far end."
"But no one will let us through,"
said Helen.
"No one will see us,"
said Roland.
"It's the platform where parcel vans go, and there's an entrance for them next to the barrier. We'll still be seen." "They're too busy to be watching all that closely. Next time one of those trolleys comes along pulling mail bags, walk beside it and keep your heads down. And then, once we're through, nip over into the crowd."
"There," said Roland a few minutes later. "It was easy." "You've some nerve," said Nicholas. "Where's it come from all of a sudden?" "You were pretty glad of it this afternoon," said David.
"Have you thought what'll be said at home?"
"Gosh, no," said Nicholas. "That's serious, isn't it? I tell you what, you and I'll wash in one lavatory on the train, and Helen and Roland in the other. There are always 2 in the last coach." "OK, but we'll only have about 10 minutes. When the train arrived, the children jumped into the rear coach and locked themselves in the lavatories.
"There's no plug for the wash basin,"
said Helen.
"Screw up a paper towel and shove it in,"
said Roland. There was very little soap. Helen and Roland washed themselves frantically, using the towels to scrape away the mud. But although the paper was harsh to the skin, it had no strength. It rolled into shreds, covering everything with pellets of sogginess. The electric train picked up speed, and the children were thrown about between the narrow walls. They collided with each other and the wash basin, which slopped water over them at every jolt. There was hardly room to share the mirror, and they were quickly knee-deep in wet paper towels. In the 10 minutes, all they managed
was to accentuate their wildness. The few patches of skin threw into contrast the mud and plaster. The children inspected each other under the lamp at the bottom of the station approach. Their house was only 50 yards up the road. "We've made things worse," said David. "We need about 6 baths each." "Do you think we could all sneak into the bathroom without being nabbed?" said Roland. "We'll try," said Nicholas. "But there's going to be a row anyway. We can't hide our clothes." "Let's hope the key's not been taken out of the shed yet," said David. A spare key to the house was always kept on a ledge above the door inside the coal shed. It was still there. The children crept round to the sitting-room window and listened. "The TV's on," said David. "One of Dad's westerns." "Good, plenty of noise." "After me," said Nicholas, "and I'll murder anyone who coughs." He slid the key into the lock and waited until there was the cover of gunfire before opening the door. A damp, carbolic air met them in the hall. Nicholas felt for the light switch and eased it on. The hall floor and the stairs were carpeted with newspapers. All the furniture was gone, and the shade from the light. Nicholas closed the door and led the way. They were just on the stairs when they heard their mother call, "Is that you, Nick?" "It was the switch," said David. "It always makes the picture jump." "Keep moving," said Nicholas. Then, louder, "Yes, we're back." But it was hopeless. The sitting-room door opened, and there stood Mrs. Watson, and behind her 1,000 redskins bit the dust. Chapter 8. The Deep End. Nicholas ought to have had more sense at his age. What was he thinking of to let everyone get into this state? Didn't he realize that all the clothes were packed? Their mother had quite enough to do without this. Couldn't they be trusted to behave properly when they were out by themselves? And surely there were better ways of spending the time than acting like hooligans in the slums. The television set was in a bare room among the packing cases. Its own cardboard box was waiting, open, next to it on the floor. The sound had been turned down at the beginning of the row, which was accompanied as a result by a silent counterpoint of gun battle and cavalry charge. And although the picture was badly distorted, even in the worst moments of the telling off, everybody's eyes kept sliding round to the screen. "And what's that rubbish?" said Mrs. Watson. Some things we found," said Roland. "And you brought them back? Good heavens, child, what will you do next? Take them outside at once. You don't know where they've been." The children escaped to the bathroom, while their mother unpacked the cases to find them a change of clothes. Cleaning was a lot easier than it had been on the train, but the lime in the plaster set hard when they tried to wash their hair. "Where have you put the treasures?" said Helen. "In the shed," said Roland. "How are we going to stow them in the furniture van tomorrow?" "We're not." "But we can't leave them." "Of course not," said Roland. "But the house is going to be empty for at least a month, so we'll hide the treasures here. And when we've found somewhere safe for them in the new house, we'll come back and collect them." "Where'll we hide them, though?" said Helen. "Through the hatch in our room," said Nicholas. "Yes," said David. "No one will look there." In the wall of the boys' attic there was a door about a foot square, leading into the space between the ceiling joists and the roof. It was too small for an adult to climb through without having a good reason. "And when Mum's cooled down, perhaps we can tell her about it. Or at least ask her to let us keep the treasures in the house," said Roland. "They'll be all right if we clean them up a bit." "I've not much hope of that," said Nicholas. "You can't blame Mum for going off at the deep end tonight, and she won't forget it in a hurry. And what are we going to tell her? And who's going to try? If we say, 'Mum, we went into an old church and came out in a different place on the other side, and these are really 4 valuable treasures,' what'll happen? You know how hot she is on the truth." "But it is the truth," said Roland. "And would you believe it if it hadn't happened to you?" "Yes, if it was somebody I trusted," said Roland. "Well, perhaps you would," said Nicholas, "but normal people wouldn't." "Could we say they're for something one of us is doing at school?" said Helen. "But it wouldn't be the truth,"
Oh, Nick. Have you ever tried lying to Mum? Said Nicholas. Then what can we do? I don't know, said Nicholas. We've got to manage it by ourselves. No one can help us.
Among the confusion of the next morning, it was easy for the children to hide the treasures behind the bedroom wall. Roland squeezed through the hatch and laid them out of sight between two joists. At last, the tailboard of the furniture van was fastened, and the children went on ahead in the car with their parents. The new house was only about 6 miles away. Mrs. Watson spoke of it as a country cottage, which it may have been 100 years earlier, but now it stood in a suburban road, and its front door, with the porch, opened onto the footpath. It was a brick cottage with 4 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but Mr. Watson had had a bathroom and an extra bedroom built over the kitchen. The old black-leaded grates had been scrapped and replaced with yellow tiles, except for the one in the sitting room, which Mr. Watson had made himself in rustic brick. Mrs. Watson had searched antique shops for horse brasses to hang on the walls, and she'd also found 3 samplers, 2 coach lamps, and a framed map of the county, hand-coloured and dated 1622. The cottage was convenient for the station, so that Mr. Watson could travel to work in Manchester, yet, being in an outer suburb, there were fields half a mile away. It was a much smaller house than the one they were leaving, but Mrs. Watson said it was worth the sacrifice for the children to be able to grow up in the country. The first thing Roland saw when the car turned into the road was the porch. For an instant, he felt that something would happen. The porch was out of place here now. It belonged to Elidor. His vision of it against the mound had been so clear that the actual porch was a faded likeness by comparison. But suppose when they opened the door, there was a passage beyond it, lit by a dead light. "Here we are," said Mr. Watson. "Welcome home, everybody." There were newspapers on the floor, but the carbolic smell was going. They set up base next to the kitchen, in the dining room, according to Mrs. Watson, but the children called it the middle room. The stairs went up one wall, and under them was the larder. The furniture was unloaded into the sitting room, which opened by way of the porch straight onto the footpath, without any hall. By evening, it was possible to eat off a table, to watch television, and to sleep. The children went to bed early. The stairs came through the floor of the boys' room, so they all sat in Helen's, which, being newly built, had a well-fitting door. "We'd better decide what we can do to keep the treasures safe," said Roland. "Drop them in a lead box and bury them," said Nicholas. "We must be able to put our hands on them quickly," said David, "in case Malibran wants them back at any time." "I don't think he will," said Nicholas. "We may as well face it at the start. You saw what came out of the forest, and what were climbing over the battlements. He didn't stand a chance." "I thought that at first," said Roland. "But I think there was one chance. Didn't you notice something about Malibran right at the end? He wasn't really frightened. He was more excited, as if the important thing was to send us through the door." "That's just it," said Helen. "He didn't care what happened to him as long as the treasures were safe." "I don't know," said Roland. "He said that it was fear coming out of the mound, and we were making all those things out of it with our imaginations. Well, he was right, because I'd seen some of them before." "You would have," said Nicholas. "That bird with arms," said Roland. "And that thing with its face in the middle of its chest. They're in those pictures in the art hall at my school. You know, where everybody's being shoveled into hell. And did you see that tall, thin thing covered in hair with a long nose?" said Helen. "I can remember dreaming about it when I was little, after I'd been frightened by Mum's fox fur." "What are you driving at?" said David. "Do you mean that those things were real, only as long as we were there or scared of them? So, once we'd left Elidor, they'd all disappear?" said Helen. "I think so," said Roland. "I hope so," said Nicholas. "But we'll probably never know."
"What are we going to do about the treasures?" said David. "Should we make a special place for them which we can keep a secret?" "Better not," said Roland. "If we don't have them with us, we can't be sure they're safe." "It'd be easier to talk Mum round if we had the real sword to show her," said David, "and not 2 bits of stick." "But haven't you noticed," said Roland, "the treasures still feel their own shapes when you hold them. They only look like scrap."
"Oh, I don't know anything about that," said Nicholas. "Yours may feel different, but a stone's just a stone when you're humping it around."
Chapter 9. Stat.
Roland decided to fetch the treasures at the end of the first week in the cottage. Every Friday he brought his games clothes home from school in a rucksack, and there would be plenty of room for the cup and the stone, while he could manage the other treasures easily. It was left to Roland because he was the only one to go to school by train. He would get off at the station for the old house, collect the treasures, and catch the next train home. It felt strange to walk down from the platform with the usual travellers, other schoolchildren and businessmen old and rich enough to leave their offices at 3:30, to walk down the steps and then to see not the hall light shining through the stained glass of the front door, but a for sale board behind the hedge and the windows blank. When Roland unlatched the gate, he realized how much of his life had not moved with him to the cottage. The unique sounds of a house, the noise of that gate, of his feet on that path. Wherever he went, he would never take those with him. And yet already there was something different about the house, even after a week. Roland felt it as a kind of awkwardness, almost uneasiness in his being there. And as he reached the door, this suddenly became so strong that the hair on the back of his neck tingled, and his palms were cramped with pins and needles. It was a sensation so close to fear, and yet Roland was not afraid. Then the door opened in front of him as he put the key in the lock. There was a man standing in the shadowy hall. "What do you want, son?" said the man in a hard, flat Manchester voice. Nothing," said Roland. The man was wearing overalls and carried some electrical equipment. Once Roland saw this, he was reassured. "I used to live here. We moved last week, and I've come back to pick up a few things." "Such as?"
"Oh, just some bits and pieces."
"You're not one of these here radio enthusiasts by any chance, are you?" said the man. "A little knowledge is a dangerous thing, you know. You could do yourself a mischief."
"Oh, no," said Roland. "My brother's keen, and I've another brother with a transistor set, but I'm no good at that sort of thing."
"Aye," said the man. "There's somewhat peculiar going on here. There is that."
"What do you mean?" said Roland.
"Well," said the man, "all this week we've had naught but complaints at the post office from the streets round here about radio and TV interference, and a lot more besides. A proper deluge. So me and me mate comes out in our detective van this afternoon, and there's no 2 chances about the signal we're getting from this house. There's somebody here jamming every frequency we've got, and a few more on top, I'd reckon."
"But the electricity's switched off at the meter," said Roland.
"I know it is," said the engineer. "I had to go to the house agents for a key, and I've checked mains and wiring. No, it's somewhat like a generator going full belt and then some."
"Can't you tell which room it's in?"
said Roland. "Not a chance. It's too strong. Every needle's peaking high enough to quench itself as soon as we switch on. We'll have to come in morning and try again. Maybe a freak, though I doubt it." He looked back up the stairs. "And I'll tell you another thing. This house is full of stat."
"What?"
"Stat. Static electricity. And I'll tell you somewhat else. I can't earth it. What do you say to that?"
Yes,"
said Roland. "Eh? I can't earth it," said the engineer.
"What?"
"Gosh," said Roland. since the man persisted in demanding an answer. "I've not seen aught like it. I have not. It's a right bobby-dazzler." The GPO van drove off into the dusk, leaving Roland in the hall. The engineer had warned him not to switch the electricity on, just in case there was a fault that he'd not been able to find. But Roland had never intended to make the visit obvious, and he'd brought a torch with him. The air inside the house was so dry that it rustled as he moved. A blue spark cracked between his hand and the banisters when he climbed the stairs, and it felt as though all his hair was on end. Every time he touched anything, sparks flashed. It must be the electricity he was talking about, thought Roland. He went up to the attic. Roland's lips and mouth pricked with the metallic sweetness of the air. But he reasoned that perhaps this was because he was at the top of the house. He knelt down to open the hatch. There was a strong smell of ozone in the space under the roof. The treasures were as he had left them. Roland squirmed through the hatch and went sideways over the joist to avoid the ceiling plaster in between. The fine dust that lay over everything didn't rise when he disturbed it. It was so charged with the static electricity that it clung like fur. Roland felt that he was crawling on an animal. He worked the treasures from joist to joist, put them through into the room, and dragged himself after them. He wrapped the stone in his football shirt and the cup in a towel. Then he turned to close the hatch. But there were the shadows of two men in the torchlight on the attic wall. After the first pulse of horror, Roland didn't move. He saw every detail of plaster on the wall. He heard every sound in the house and in the road outside. He didn't breathe. His mind raced so that every second was 10. The shadows were not anybody in the room. It was too small and bare for anybody to be in it unseen. And they would have to be between the torch and the wall to make shadows. This was my bedroom. There's nothing to be frightened of here. There are marks on the wall. Damp patches because the house is empty. He went closer. They remained the same size, flat shadows on the wall, motionless, sharp and black. It's an optical illusion. I'll shut my eyes and count 10. Or it's all that static electricity. It's a freak, like the man said. Roland shut his eyes, but he could still see the two figures, reversed like a negative image, yellow against the black screen of his eyelids. He opened his eyes, black on yellow, closed them, yellow on black, but just as clear. He shook his head, and the men vanished, and then reappeared. He turned his head slowly to one side and back. He could see the shadows with his eyes closed only when he was facing the wall. Roland opened his eyes and switched off the torch. In the darkness of the attic, the yellow shadows were full size. The air was alive with tiny sparks, and they were thickest round the outline of the shadows, like iron filings clustering about a magnet. Now the force in the room seemed to hold Roland's head locked in one position, so that he couldn't look away. A numbness was spreading into his limbs, and in his mind and all around him he felt or heard a noise, high, whining, powerful, and the sparks merged into blue flame along the edges of the two shapes. He willed his hands to switch on the torch, but the flame still showed even in the light, and the blackness of the shadows was more solid than the wall itself. The shadows were becoming independent of the wall, cut loose by the blue flame. They stood both in front of the wall and behind it. They were becoming not shadows, but black holes in the air, holes in space. Roland felt that if he watched a moment longer, something irrevocable would happen, and that by watching, he would be the cause. He threw himself backwards from the attic and leapt down the stairs. Cold fire blazed around him from the air. He cleared the last 6 steps to the hall, sensing the whole weight of the house poised over his head. He opened the front door and ran onto the path without looking back. Behind him, the door slammed shut on the silent, empty rooms. Chapter 10. Choke. Of course, it seemed different once he was on the train. In the brightly lit compartment, and among other people, he realized that there could be a normal explanation for everything. He knew that static electricity could produce strange effects, and the engineer had said there was a lot of it in the house. He'd frightened himself before by staring at something quite ordinary in a poor light. "Come off it, Roland, you're always imagining things." That was a family joke. When he reached home, Roland put the treasures on a high shelf in the garage, where they would be unnoticed until they could be hidden in the loft over the bathroom. By now, most of his fright had dropped away. He left the garage, crossed to the house, and shut the kitchen door behind him, all rather quickly. But already the impression of what he'd seen was becoming very confused. The shadows were not so clearly shadows. They could have been faults in the wall plaster shown up by the torchlight, or an effect of the dust and the static electricity, somehow. Friday was the best day of the week. After tea, homework could wait. The first cloud would not appear before Sunday morning. A whole evening lay ahead to be enjoyed. The children washed up while their mother arranged sandwiches and cake on a trolley for supper. Mr. Watson went out in the car to buy a box of chocolates to celebrate their first week in the cottage, and then he brought in coal and stoked the fire. "Did you get them?" said David to Roland. "Yes, they're in the garage." "What is it on TV tonight, Frank?" said Mrs. Watson from the sitting room. "I'm just looking, dear," Mr. Watson answered. "Do you know anything about static electricity?" said Roland. "A bit," said David. "There was an engineer from the post office at the house. He said there'd been complaints. He said the house was full of static electricity, and—" "It's the circus, then a play, and then ice skating," said Mr. Watson. "Oh, good. Hurry up, children. The circus is on in a few minutes, and there's a play and ice skating." And he said there must be a generator. "Right, Mum," said David. "Coming." A generator wouldn't give static. "But there were sparks everywhere, little blue ones." "Never mind," said Nicholas. "Leave it. Dad's just switched on." End of Side 3.